I was just finishing up some work on my laptop when I heard a knock at the door. It wasn't hurried or sharp, more of a patient rhythm, like someone who wasn't in a rush. When I opened it, there she was, the woman who lived across the street. Her name was Claire, though I'd never once called her anything other than Miss Claire. She taught literature at the local college, and even though she carried herself with that calm, professional poise that made everyone treat her with a certain kind of respect, there was always something quietly approachable about her too. That afternoon, her hair was pulled back loosely, a few strands slipping down and brushing against her cheek. She wore a soft cream sweater, sleeves pushed to her elbows, and her eyes, steady and clear, met mine with a small smile. "Could you give me a hand with something?" she asked, shifting her weight lightly from one foot to the other. "I've got a couple of boxes in the car, and I'm afraid they're heavier than I planned for." I nodded right away, maybe too quickly. Of course. The air outside was warm with the fading heat of late afternoon. As we crossed the street together, she told me she'd just been to a book fair, stocking up for her classes. I could hear the hint of weariness in her voice, but also a kind of excitement, like even after years of teaching, books still lit something inside her. When she opened the trunk, I saw exactly what she meant. Stacks of thick, hardback novels sat waiting, the spines worn but proud. She bent slightly, bracing her hands against one of the boxes, and I stepped forward quickly. "Let me take that one," I said, reaching down. My fingers brushed against hers for the briefest moment. Her hands were cool from the steering wheel, mine warm from the sun. It wasn't much, just a touch, but it lingered in my mind longer than it should have. We carried the boxes together, side by side, the sound of gravel crunching under our shoes. I couldn't help but notice the way she kept glancing over to make sure I wasn't straining, as though she wasn't used to asking for help and felt a little guilty about it. Her front door opened into a space that already smelled faintly of her, a clean, subtle fragrance, like fresh pages mixed with tea leaves. I set the box down near the hallway and straightened up. "Thank you," she said, brushing a strand of hair back behind her ear. "I don't know what I would have done without you." Her voice was soft, but there was a warmth beneath it, the kind that makes you want to stay in the conversation a little longer, even if it's only about something as simple as moving books. And in that small, ordinary moment, carrying boxes across the street, I couldn't ignore the quiet flutter in my chest. Stepping into her house always felt like stepping into another world. The first thing that caught me wasn't just the shelves, though there were plenty of those, books stacked neatly from floor to ceiling, filling every corner of the living room. What struck me most was how alive the space felt. The books weren't there to impress anyone. They were worn, read, loved. Their spines carried the history of her fingertips. Their pages carried the faint perfume of time. I paused for a moment, taking it all in, and she noticed. "Messy, isn't it?" Claire laughed softly as she pushed the door shut behind us. I keep telling myself I'll organize them properly one day. But then another story comes along, and, well, she gestured helplessly, her hand floating in the air as though the books had won the argument years ago. "It doesn't look messy," I said, surprising myself with how quickly the words came. "It looks like home." Her eyes lingered on me just a moment longer than expected, a flicker of something unreadable passing through them. Then she smiled, a little softer this time. "Tea?" she asked. I followed her into the kitchen, where the sunlight filtered lazily through gauzy curtains, turning the room into a canvas of warm gold. The kettle whistled gently as she filled it, her movements unhurried, almost graceful. She had a way of making even the simplest action, rinsing out the teapot, brushing a stray hair back from her cheek, feel deliberate, meaningful. I leaned against the counter, watching. Not in a way I meant to be obvious, but in that half-guilty way you do when you're aware you're noticing more than you should. The curve of her shoulders under her sweater, the way her fingers tapped lightly against the ceramic mug as if keeping time with a thought. When she handed me the cup, our fingers brushed again. Warm this time, tea seeping through porcelain into skin. I murmured a quiet thanks, hoping it didn't sound as distracted as I felt. We carried our cups into the living room and sat across from each other. The lamplight had been switched on, chasing away the fading afternoon. Between us, steam rose and curled in the air, dissolving like words unspoken. She spoke first, asking about my studies, my plans. But before long, the conversation drifted toward her world. Her classes, the endless cycle of papers to grade, the way students either surprised her with brilliance or broke her heart with apathy. There was a pause then, one of those unplanned silences that should feel heavy but didn't. She looked down at her cup, tracing the rim with her fingertip, and then up at me again. Do you ever feel like the years slip by faster than you can hold them? She asked quietly. The question hung in the air, tender and vulnerable. I swallowed before answering, because I knew she wasn't asking about time in general, she was asking about herself. And in that moment, in the quiet of her book-filled house, I realized she wasn't just letting me help her with boxes. She was letting me see her. Time has a way of slipping through unnoticed when you're comfortable. By the time I glanced at the window again, the light outside had shifted from golden afternoon to the first shades of dusk. The sky beyond her curtains was brushed in soft lavender, the streetlights across the road blinking awake one by one. I set my teacup down, half empty and long since cooled, and leaned back slightly. I should probably let you get back to your evening, I said, though even as the words left my mouth, I felt a quiet reluctance settle in my chest. Claire looked toward the window too, her lips pressing together for a brief second before she shook her head. It's still early, she said softly. Then, almost like an afterthought, stay a little longer. If you don't mind. Something in the way she said it, not commanding, not casual, but hopeful, made it impossible to refuse. Of course, I replied, my voice steadier than I felt. We moved to the sofa, side by side this time. The lamp on the side table cast a gentle amber glow over the room, painting shadows that seemed to draw us closer. Outside, the world had quieted, no cars passed, no footsteps echoed. It felt as though her house was the only place still alive. Our conversation wandered, as conversations often do in the company of someone you trust. She spoke about her students, her love for literature, but then drifted into quieter subjects, dreams she once had, ones she never fully pursued. I thought I'd travel more, she said, her voice low but steady. I imagined myself in Paris, sitting at cafes, scribbling notes about the world. But then one year turned into another. Teaching became my anchor. And I suppose, she trailed off, shaking her head with a rueful smile, the world doesn't wait. Her words carried a weight that pressed softly against me. I turned toward her, meeting her eyes. The world might not wait, I said, but it doesn't mean it's gone. For a moment she just looked at me, really looked, as if testing whether I believed what I was saying. And in that silence, I felt the air grow thicker, filled with something neither of us wanted to break. Her laugh came then, quiet and almost embarrassed, and she shifted slightly, her shoulder brushing against mine. The contact was small, unintentional perhaps, but it stayed there, the warmth of her body a steady reminder that she hadn't moved away. I became suddenly aware of the closeness, the way our knees nearly touched. The faint sound of her breathing, slow but uneven, as though she too felt the gravity of the moment. We sat like that, side by side in the dim lamplight, words giving way to something quieter, something unspoken. And in that stillness, with dusk wrapped around us and her presence steady beside me, I realized that neither of us wanted the night to end just yet. The silence between us wasn't uncomfortable. If anything, it felt necessary, like the room itself was giving her space to gather her thoughts. She sat with her hands folded around her teacup, staring at the faint swirl of liquid at the bottom as if searching for something there. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer than before, almost fragile. There was someone once, she said. The words hung in the air like a confession, quiet but heavy. Someone I thought I'd spend the rest of my life with. I stayed still, letting her guide the pace. We were young, she continued. Too young to know what forever really meant. He was charming, ambitious, always reaching for more. And for a while, I believed in that vision of the future with him. But people change. Or maybe they just reveal themselves more clearly with time. She paused, her lips tightening. He left. Just like that. No big fight, no dramatic ending. Just a slow drifting until one day I realized he was already gone. Her eyes lifted to meet mine, and in that moment I saw more than a story. I saw the quiet ache of years carried alone, hidden beneath her composed exterior. I threw myself into teaching after that, she said. It was easier to focus on guiding other people's futures than to admit I'd lost hold of my own. Her words struck me harder than I expected. There was something deeply human about the way she laid it out, not as a plea for sympathy, but as an acknowledgement of her own scars. I set my cup aside, leaning in slightly. My hand hovered for a moment before I let it rest gently on her wrist. Her skin was cool against my palm, and I felt her pulse steady beneath my fingertips. She didn't flinch. In fact, she breathed out softly, almost like the touch itself gave her permission to release some of the weight she'd been holding. "I'm sorry," I said quietly. "That must have been lonely," she finished for me. Her lips curved into a small, bittersweet smile. "But I survived. We always do, don't we?" Her words were brave, but her eyes betrayed her. There was a shimmer there, the kind that comes when someone speaks of old wounds that never fully closed. I wanted to tell her that survival wasn't enough, that she deserved more than just getting by. But the words caught in my throat. Instead, I let the silence hold us again, my hand still resting lightly on her wrist, grounding her, grounding both of us. The clock ticked softly in the background, marking the passing of a moment I knew I would remember. A moment where her strength and her vulnerability stood side by side, and I felt the quiet privilege of being allowed to witness both. She pulled in a slow breath, steadied herself, and offered me a look that was both fragile and strong. "Thank you," she whispered. "Not for the tea, not for the company, but for listening, for staying." And somehow, that felt like the most important thank you I'd ever received. The room had grown quiet again, but it wasn't the quiet of awkwardness. It was the kind of silence that settles when two people have said enough for now, when words can no longer carry the weight of what's being felt. Claire sat beside me, her teacup now abandoned on the coffee table. She leaned back slightly into the sofa, her hands folded loosely in her lap. Her gaze drifted toward the window, where the streetlights glowed faintly against the darkening sky, and then slowly back to me. There was no urgency in her eyes, no expectation, just presence. I became acutely aware of the space we shared, or rather, the lack of it. Our shoulders brushed lightly, fabric against fabric, and the warmth from her body seeped through to mine. I thought about shifting, creating more distance, but the idea felt wrong. She didn't move either. The only sounds were small ones. The steady ticking of the clock on the wall, the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, and the almost imperceptible rhythm of her breathing. Each breath seemed to draw me closer, as if the air between us was a thread pulling tight. I let my eyes linger on her profile. The gentle slope of her cheekbone, the way a loose strand of hair had slipped free and curled along her neck, the soft crease at the corner of her lips when she wasn't quite smiling but wasn't solemn either. She turned slightly, as though sensing my gaze, and for a moment our eyes locked. The connection held longer than I expected. Long enough that I felt my chest tighten, long enough that I knew she could see more in my expression than I had intended to reveal. Her lips parted, as if she might say something, but then she closed them again and lowered her eyes. Instead, her hand shifted slightly on the sofa between us, fingers brushing faintly against mine. The contact was featherlight, almost uncertain, but it sent a quiet jolt through me. I didn't pull away. Our hands stayed close, not fully entwined, but close enough that the warmth passed between us in a steady current. It was such a small thing, yet it felt monumental, as though everything that had been unspoken between us was suddenly real, resting there in the half-inch of space her touch had closed. Neither of us broke the silence. We didn't need to. The pause carried more meaning than words could have. Time seemed to stretch, the edges of the moment blurring. It was just the two of us, suspended in that stillness, balanced delicately between what had been and what could be. And though nothing more happened, no sudden confessions, no dramatic gestures, I felt the shift. A quiet, undeniable shift. Because sometimes, it's not the words or the actions that change everything. Sometimes, it's the silence. Her hand was still resting close to mine, the faintest brush of her fingers a steady reminder of everything neither of us had dared to say. The silence stretched on, thick with unspoken questions, until at last Claire drew in a slow breath. "I shouldn't feel this way," she murmured, her voice so soft it almost disappeared into the hum of the room. I turned toward her. "Feel what way?" Her eyes flicked up to meet mine, uncertain, then dropped again to our hands. "Like this. Sitting here with you, wishing the night wouldn't end, wondering what people would say if they saw us." Her tone wasn't dramatic. If anything, it was careful, as though she was testing how much of her truth she could reveal without frightening it away. I swallowed, my heart thudding a little harder in my chest. "What would they say?" I asked gently. She gave a soft, almost bitter laugh. "That I should know better. That I'm older, that it's foolish. That I'm—" She stopped herself, shaking her head. "It doesn't matter." I let the pause stretch, wanting to choose my words with the same care she had. Finally, I said, "I don't think it's foolish. Not if it feels real." Her gaze lifted then, and there was something raw in her eyes, something that stripped away all the calm composure she usually carried. Vulnerability, yes, but also hope. "You really mean that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded. "Being here with you, it doesn't feel wrong. It feels natural, like it's where I'm supposed to be." Her lips parted slightly, as though my words had caught her off guard. For a moment she didn't speak, and then she let out a shaky breath that sounded almost like relief. Without thinking, I shifted closer. Our hands, which had been brushing but not fully touching, finally closed the distance. Her fingers curled around mine, tentative at first, then firmer, as though she needed the reassurance of contact. The warmth of her hand spread through me, steadying and electric all at once. She leaned in slowly, her head coming to rest against my shoulder. The weight of it was gentle, but it anchored me in a way I hadn't expected. I could feel her cheek against my chest, soft and warm, the faintest rhythm of her breathing syncing with mine. For a long moment neither of us moved, neither of us spoke. Then, almost too quietly to hear, she whispered, "I don't want to be afraid anymore." I tightened my hold on her hand, my thumb brushing lightly across her skin. "Then don't be. Not with me." The words weren't rehearsed, but they were true. And in that fragile, tender moment, it felt like the walls she had built for years were finally beginning to fall. Not all at once, but gently, like a door slowly opening. And I knew. She had let me in. The lamplight bathed the room in a soft amber glow, the kind of light that seems to hold time still. Claire hadn't moved from where her head rested against my shoulder, and I hadn't moved either. There was no need to. For the first time all evening, her breathing was even, unhurried, as if some of the weight she carried had finally slipped free. I let the silence stretch, not rushing it, not breaking it. My hand remained folded gently around hers, our fingers entwined in a way that felt both delicate and unshakably certain. After a while, she shifted slightly, just enough to lift her eyes to mine. The closeness between us was almost startling. I could see the faint lines at the corners of her eyes, the way her lips curved into something between a smile and hesitation. "Thank you," she said quietly. I almost asked for what, but I didn't need to. Her voice carried the answer. For listening, for staying, for seeing her not as a teacher across the street or a woman weighed down by expectations, but simply as herself. "You don't have to thank me," I said. "I wanted to be here." Her smile softened, a flicker of something tender crossing her face. She squeezed my hand lightly, then leaned closer, her lips brushing against my cheek in a kiss so gentle it felt more like a promise than a gesture. My chest tightened, not with nerves, but with a warmth that spread slowly, filling every corner of me. Outside, the night deepened. A cicada hummed faintly in the distance, the occasional rustle of leaves carried on the breeze. But inside, it was just us, wrapped in the quiet intimacy of the moment. She pulled back only slightly, enough to meet my gaze again. "I don't know what this is," she admitted, her voice low but steady. "But I know it feels right." I nodded, holding her eyes. "It doesn't have to be anything more than that. Not tonight. We'll figure it out together." Something in those words seemed to settle her. She let out a small laugh, not nervous this time, but free, unguarded. Then she leaned back into me, her head finding its place against my chest again, as though it had always belonged there. We stayed like that, the world outside fading into nothing more than background noise. There was no rush, no need for grand declarations. Just the quiet certainty of two people who had found something rare, something worth holding on to. As the minutes slipped into hours, I realized I didn't care how late it was, or what anyone else might say. What mattered was that I was here, with her, and she wanted me to stay. And so I did. Not just for the night, but for whatever came after.